Okay, so today we're going to talk about food chains, and tomorrow we'll talk about food webs. So we've talked about relationships between organisms before last week. This week we're going to focus on the predator-prey relationship and kind of who eats who in an ecosystem. So on this slide you can see both a food chain and a food web. This is a food chain right here, and here's a food web. Today we're going to focus on the food chain. A food chain is a really simple version that depicts who eats who in an ecosystem, but it only depicts one chain, so one link of organisms, whereas a food web kind of shows all the different organisms and points out who eats who amongst the whole ecosystem. So the food chain is really just a simple version of what eats what without getting too complex. So we're going to focus on that today, and then we'll work on food webs tomorrow. So obviously organisms are connected in a lot of different ways. We talked about that last week with coexistence, cooperation, mutualism, all these symbiotic relationships too. Today and tomorrow we're going to focus on that predator-prey relationship and this idea that organisms need to eat, and we want to figure out who eats who in an ecosystem so we can figure out what's going to get affected if a population declines or increases. So this week we're going to focus on the idea that organisms are connected to each other by their feeding relationships. So not only do they help each other out sometimes and coexist sometimes, but they also are connected by who and what they eat. Alright, so to understand how to create a food chain, you have to understand the different parts of it. So there are two main parts of a food chain, producers and consumers. So some organisms produce their own food. Hopefully you learned that last year, and you learned that when we talked about photosynthesis. We call organisms that produce their own food producers. Or we can also call them autotrophs. Auto means self, so they produce their own food, they produce their food themselves. So to produce this food they use photosynthesis that creates glucose, which is food. So it's plants that are producers in a food chain. Some organisms cannot make their own food, so they have to get their food from eating other organisms. So we call these organisms consumers or heterotrophs. Hetero means different, so they have to get their food from a different source. They can't make it themselves. So instead of just calling them all consumers, we can actually split them up and get a little more specific. There are first-order consumers, second-order consumers, and third-order consumers. So let's say we're looking at this food pyramid, which is another way of showing a food chain. The kelp on the bottom, that's a plant, so that's a producer. But then these three organisms here, they don't produce their own food, so they're consumers. So we can split them up by what's closest to the kelp. So the sea urchin eats the kelp directly, so we call it a first-order consumer. The sheephead would be the second-order consumer, and it eats the sea urchin. And then the giant sea bass is the third-order consumer, and it eats the sheephead. We could keep going up, so if there was a fourth consumer, we would call it the fourth-order consumer. A fifth one, the fifth-order consumer. It just helps split it up a little instead of calling them all consumers, which is true, but we can split them up into orders. So first order, second order, third order, based on which one's closest to the kelp. So the one closest to the producer is the first-order consumer. Okay, so really quickly, find a spot on your notes. I know there's not a lot of room, but maybe at the top. And we're just going to check really quickly that you understand the difference between producer and consumer. So for each picture, write down if it's a picture of a producer or a consumer on your notes. So there's two pictures here. Write down if each picture is a producer or a consumer. Okay, the next one, write if it's a producer or a consumer. Okay, the next one, producer or consumer. Okay, the next one, this little happy organism, producer or consumer. Okay, finally this one, producer or consumer. Okay, so let's just check your work really quickly. Hopefully the flower you said was producer, the tiger, consumer. If you were looking at the little monkey, it's a consumer. If you were looking at the tree, it's a producer. The plants here are producers. Human is a consumer. And then the zebra is a consumer. If you were looking at the grass, you could write producer. Okay. Another part of a food chain is a decomposer. So decomposers are a type of heterotroph, and they break down remains of dead organisms and the waste of living things. So that's going to be kind of the last part of the food chain. So there are different types of decomposers. Worms are a type, and bacteria are another type. Those are kind of the two most common types of decomposers. They feed off dead organisms, and they break them down and use that for their energy, and they kind of help recycle waste back into the ecosystem. Okay, so each feeding relationship, each relationship between two organisms is called a trophic level. So producers, like in this picture, make up the first trophic level 1. Consumers make up the rest of the trophic levels, and each one is numbered. So trophic level 2, trophic level 3, trophic level 4. Hopefully you're noticing over here that we can also call consumers other names. Instead of first order consumer, second order consumer, third order consumer, we can call them primary consumer, secondary, and tertiary. This is just another type of language for describing a food chain. Either one is fine. Okay, so a food chain itself is a series of organisms in which each feeds on the one at the next lower level. The arrows that you're noticing in these food chains show the direction of energy flow, so basically who's eating who. You're always going to start with energy coming from the sun because plants need that energy. Then you're going to have your producer, and then your arrows are going to keep going up through all of your consumers. Usually you end with a decomposer at the end of the food chain. A food chain only shows one path for flow of energy. There are not going to be arrows cutting across or cutting through. It's just going to show one direct path. Tomorrow we'll talk about food webs, which will have arrows going in different directions, but right now food chains only show one direct path for flow of energy. Okay, so we're going to draw out a food chain together so you know how to create one. Here are the key steps. First, you're always going to start with a producer. So on your sheet, you want to draw grass or write grass and write producer underneath it. Up here, you're going to draw a sun because the energy is always coming from the sun. So you might want to draw a little sun above the grass and then an arrow to the grass. So even though we always start with a producer, we know the producer always gets their energy from the sun. So you also want to draw the sun to start off the food chain too. Okay, then you're going to add the first order consumer. So you're going to draw a line and add the grasshopper, which is the first order consumer. You can draw it or you can write it. If you know what a grasshopper looks like, you can draw it. Then you're going to add the rest of your consumers. So it goes lizard, snake, kookaburra, and bacteria is our decomposer. We end with the decomposer. So then you label each one. So producer, first order consumer, second order consumer, third order consumer. Here's another third order consumer, and decomposer. Finally, if you haven't already, you're going to connect your food chain with arrows showing the flow of energy. So again, the energy is always going up through to the consumers, through to the decomposer. Again, over here you want to draw the sun, starting with the sun. Not every food chain will show the sun, but we should just know in our heads that the sun is there as the source of energy. Okay, you can pause this video if you want to finish drawing that, but we're going to move on to a few practice questions together. Alright, Alright, so in the box on your notes, you're going to sort these animals into a food chain. Think about what needs to go first and what would go last. Take about 30 more seconds. Okay, hopefully you put the grass first as our producer, the rabbit second, that eats the grass, and then the fox third, that eats the rabbit. If you want, you could also label your food chain. The grass is the producer, the rabbit is the first order consumer, and the fox is the second order consumer. Okay, let's try another one. That's what yours should look like. Alright, sort these animals into a food chain. This is a mouse, by the way, a snake, and a hawk. Take about 30 more seconds. After you sort them into the food chain, label the producers, the consumers, and the decomposer if there is one. Okay, so hopefully you put the grass first, the mouse second, the snake third, and the hawk last. There was no decomposer in this food chain, so we'd label the grass producer, the mouse first order consumer, the snake second order consumer, and the hawk third order consumer. Okay, if there was a decomposer, it would go last and we could label it decomposer, but I didn't put one up for this one. Remember, the sun is giving all the energy to the grass, to the producers. Okay, you're going to move on to the readings and completing the 4 boxes using the next box on blend space.